The G7. This is the most powerful club in the world, or at least it used to be. June 2026, Evian-les-Bains, France. 7 leaders and a name that once meant the people who ran the planet, the G7.
I'm the boss.
But here's the problem now. In 1980, these 7 countries were about 60% of the global economy. That was when it could actually move things, solve global crises even. But today, only around 44% and shrinking, that's the number. The G7 holds half of the world's wealth, but in terms of population, it stands for only 10% of humanity, a rapidly aging demographic at that. So it's the same 7 chairs, but a much smaller world inside them. And look who's missing from the table. China, the world's 2nd largest economy, isn't in the room. India, the 3rd largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity, the most populous nation on earth, is there, but only as a guest, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi at his 7th G7 in a row. His agenda? To secure representation at the high table, to urge Western countries to see eye to eye with the global South, to invoke the dire need for trust. But India relies on an invite. It is not a formal member. A summit that leaves out the 2 giants of the century isn't the full picture. It's a group photo with half the world cropped out. How did the steering committee of the planet get this small? It's a story of an oil shock that gave it a reason to exist. A Russia let in and then thrown out. Sanctions that didn't land. And a club now so divided it can hardly make a dent. So here's the question worth asking out loud. In 2026, should the G7 even exist? I am Shubhangi Sharma. Let's find the link. The group of 7 is the United States, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Canada, plus the European Union. 7 rich, industrialized, democratic unions. No charter, no headquarters, no binding votes, just an annual meeting and a joint statement nobody is legally required to obey. To understand why it exists, let's rewind to 1944 and then to the 1970s. 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. As World War II ended, the Allied powers built the financial architecture of the post-war West. The IMF, the World Bank, and a system that pegged the world's currencies to a US dollar backed by gold. America came out of the war holding most of the world's gold and half its industrial output. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. That was the foundation the West was built on. But then it cracked. In 1971, President Nixon cut the dollar's link to gold.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators.
It could no longer be converted into gold, and the system of fixed exchange rates was over. This made the value of the dollar plummet, and one of the biggest losers here were the patrons of the petrodollar, the OPEC. They found that the dollar was no longer bringing in the quality of revenue they once had. They were angry, and they were hardened by the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Arab nations led by Egypt and Syria engaged in a bloody war with Israel, which, long story short, they lost. But they used another lever of power, which brought the Western world to its knees. This was the oil shock, a crippling oil embargo against the US. Crude prices quadrupled, a rise of 300 to 400%, and this tipped the West into stagflation. The shortage was so bad, in the US especially, that drivers even pulled out their guns at gas stations. Rattled, the leaders of 6 industrial democracies, France, West Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain, and the US, gathered at a French chateau in 1975 to coordinate a response. Canada joined in 1976, and the G7 was born. Back then it made sense. In 1980, these countries produced more than 60% of world GDP. When they agreed on something, the global economy moved. And the club even tried to grow. After the Soviet collapse, Russia was courted. Mikhail Gorbachev was invited to London in 1991. Boris Yeltsin gradually pulled in until in 1998 when Russia formally joined and the G7 became the G8. That experiment lasted 16 years. But in 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, the other 7 suspended Moscow and reverted to the G7. Russia formally walked out in 2017. The one time the club expanded, it unexpanded. The G8 went back to being G7. Meanwhile, the ground had been shifting underneath it. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit, the G7 couldn't fix it alone. It had to summon the G20 because the rising powers it had excluded were now indispensable. That was the tell. The G7 had become a club reinforcing Western dominance long after the dominance itself had started to fade. Now let's get to the numbers because these are brutal. The G7's share of world GDP has fallen from over 60% in 1980 to roughly 44% in nominal terms. And once you adjust for purchasing power, that's just down to about 28%. BRICS, by contrast, overtook the G7 on that measure by the end of the 2010s and now sits near 35 to 40%. On population, it isn't even close. The G7 speaks for under 10% of humanity, but the BRICS countries speak for close to half. Meanwhile, the G20, which actually seats India, China, Brazil, all of them, covers about 85% of the world economy and 2/3 of its people. Militarily, the G7 still leads in spending. The US alone is nearly 40% of global defense outlays. But BRICS now holds China, Russia, and India, 3 of the largest armed forces on earth, 3 nuclear powers. And the G20, which actually seats all these pairs, is where the real economic bargaining now happens. So what has this exclusive club actually done lately? The G7's big infrastructure plan to counter China's Belt and Road has produced more headlines than actual highways. It's drifted from running the economy to running sanctions. Its headline move, a $60 cap on Russian oil in 2022, was supposed to drain the Kremlin's war chest. But instead, Russia rerouted its crude to India and China. It kept selling, and the West looked on, verbally criticizing but also benefiting when energy prices were skyrocketing. That's just the reality of the world. But the G7 couldn't help when another oil shock ensued. The US-Iran war raged on for more than 100 days. Energy flows were choked at the Hormuz choke point, and the poor and developing nations suffered the most. So it's worth asking the question, does the G7 exist simply to enforce Western influence? To be fair now, the case for the G7 isn't empty. One can take the position that it's a small, like-minded group of democracies and advanced economies that can actually agree on things without the paralysis of a 190-member UN, for example. Less bureaucracy, shared values, fast coordination. So when the West genuinely needs to move as one, this is the table. And it still dominates global trade, hard currency, and the financial plumbing of sanctions to a certain degree. That is real power. But the notion of shared values is contested. A steering committee that steers less than 1/3 of the world economy under 1/10 of its people and can't end the wars on its own doorstep isn't leading the world. It's holding a reunion. The G7 didn't fail because its members got weak. It's struggling because the world it was built to manage no longer exists. Reform it. Open the doors to the powers it keeps outside. But a club that excludes half the planet and calls itself the world's leadership has an expiry date. And in Avion, you could actually see it. One of the most important voices in the room actually belonged to a guest.